The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Willow Creek as Dustin Drake lowered his smoking pistol, his weathered face revealing nothing of the turmoil that churned within him. The year was 1878, and the West was still wild, untamed, and often unforgiving, much like the man himself. "Reckon that rattler won't be bothering nobody no more," he muttered to his horse, Midnight, the only living creature he allowed close these days. The townsfolk of Willow Creek whispered about Dustin whenever he rode in for supplies. Some said he'd lost his wife and child to fever years ago. Others claimed he'd been a notorious gunslinger who'd hung up his guns after one too many lives taken. The truth, like the man, remained shrouded in mystery, but everyone agreed on one thing. Dustin Drake was the bitterest, most closed-off soul for 100 miles. He tipped his hat low over his eyes as he rode into town that afternoon, the May sun beating down mercilessly. Willow Creek was growing, like many frontier towns in Colorado territory. The railroad had brought new faces, new opportunities, and new troubles. None of it mattered to Dustin. He came for ammunition, provisions, and whiskey in that order. Then he'd be gone again to his isolated cabin in the foothills. "Afternoon, Mr. Drake," called Samuel Green, the shopkeeper, as Dustin pushed through the door of the general store. Dustin nodded curtly, placing a list on the counter without a word. "Got most of what you need," Samuel said, gathering items. "Train brought in fresh stock yesterday." As Samuel assembled his order, the door opened again, bringing with it a gust of wind and a heavily pregnant woman Dustin had never seen before. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, though wisps had escaped to frame her flushed face. Despite her condition, she carried herself with dignity, though exhaustion shadowed her eyes. "Mrs. Reed, should you be out in this heat?" Samuel exclaimed. "The baby doesn't seem to care about the weather, Mr. Green," she replied with a tired smile. "I need more of that willow bark tea if you have it." "Of course, Mrs. Reed. Let me finish with Mr. Drake here and I'll get that for you right away." Dustin noticed the woman Mrs. Reed press a hand to her lower back, wincing slightly. Something unfamiliar and unwelcome stirred in him concern. "Madam," he said gruffly, tipping his hat, "take my place." Surprise flickered across her face. "Thank you, but I can wait. I insist." The words felt rusty in his mouth, unpracticed. Samuel looked between them, clearly shocked by Dustin's uncharacteristic courtesy. The woman studied Dustin for a moment, then nodded gratefully. "Bethany Reed," she introduced herself. "Dustin Drake," he replied, stepping back to give her space. "You're the one with the cabin up near Eagle Pass," she said, not a question. He raised an eyebrow. "People talk," she explained, a hint of amusement in her voice. "They do little else in this town," he agreed dryly. While Samuel fetched her tea, Bethany suddenly gasped, clutching the counter's edge. "Mrs. Reed?" Samuel asked, alarmed. "Just a strong kick," she assured them, though Dustin noted the whiteness of her knuckles. "Where's your husband, madam?" Dustin found himself asking. Something darkened in her eyes. "He's not available." The careful way she spoke told Dustin everything he needed to know. Her husband was either dead, gone, or worse. None of his business either way. Yet as she paid for her tea and turned to leave, another pain seemed to seize her. Without thinking, Dustin reached out to steady her arm. "You need help getting home?" he asked, surprising himself as much as her. "I live at the edge of town. The small house with the blue door," she replied. "But I can manage." "I'm headed that way," he lied. "No trouble." Samuel's jaw practically hit the counter at this exchange. Dustin Drake, offering assistance to anyone, let alone a stranger, was unprecedented. Outside, Dustin helped Bethany onto his horse, walking alongside as they made their way through town. He felt the stares of townsfolk burning into his back but kept his eyes forward. "They're going to talk about this for weeks," Bethany said softly. "Let them," he grunted. Nothing better to do out here. At her home, a modest but neat cabin at the edge of town, he helped her down, steadying her as her feet touched the ground. "Thank you, Mr. Drake," she said, those green eyes studying him with a frankness that made him uncomfortable. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" "It's the least I can offer." He should have declined, should have tipped his hat, wished her well, and gone back to his solitude. Instead, he found himself nodding. Inside, the small house was sparsely but comfortably furnished. A half-finished crib stood in the corner, tools laid out beside it. "My husband started it," she explained, following his gaze, "before he left for the silver mines in Leadville 3 months ago." Her hands rested on her swollen belly. "We haven't heard from him since the cave-in." Dustin absorbed this information silently. Men died in the mines every day. Sometimes bodies were never recovered. "How far along are you?" he asked. 8 months or thereabouts. As she prepared coffee, he found himself examining the unfinished crib. The craftsmanship was decent but incomplete. The side rails weren't attached, and the rockers needed to be properly secured. "I could finish this," he said, the words out before he could stop them. Bethany turned, surprise evident on her face. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he replied simply. He'd been a carpenter's apprentice before the war, before he'd become what he was now. "Why would you help me?" she asked directly. Dustin Drake, a man of few words, found himself without any. He shrugged. "Got nothing better to do tomorrow," he finally said. And so Dustin returned the next day with his tools, and the day after that. The townsfolk watched in disbelief as the bitter recluse made daily trips to the pregnant widow's home. Some whispered scandalous implications, but most were simply baffled by the change in the man they thought they knew. Working on the crib gave Dustin's hands purpose they hadn't had in years. As he worked, Bethany would sit nearby, mending clothes or preparing meals, talking about her life before Willow Creek. She'd been a schoolteacher in St. Louis, had married Thomas Reed when she was 22. They'd come west when Thomas heard about the silver boom. "What about you?" she asked one afternoon, as Dustin sanded the crib's railings. "You weren't always the mysterious mountain man of Willow Creek." He worked silently for so long she probably thought he wouldn't answer. "Was in the war," he finally said. "After that, did some things I'm not proud of. Decided people were better off without me around." "All people?" she asked softly, his hands stilled on the wood. "Most." The days stretched into a week, and as the crib neared completion, Dustin found himself inventing reasons to stay longer. There was a loose floorboard that needed fixing. The door hinges squeaked. The roof had a small leak. One evening, as they sat on her small porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Bethany suddenly gasped, clutching her belly. "What is it?" Dustin asked, alarmed. I think it's time," she said, her voice tight with pain. Panic surged through him. "I'll get the doctor." "No time," she gasped. "The baby's coming now." Dustin had faced down armed men without flinching, but the prospect of helping deliver a baby terrified him. Still, he had no choice. He helped Bethany inside, following her urgent instructions, boiling water, gathering clean linens, positioning her on the bed. "You've done this before?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Helped deliver my sister's babies," she managed between pains. "Just do what I tell you." The next few hours were a blur of pain, fear, and determination. Bethany was stronger than anyone Dustin had ever known, fighting through the agony with a fierce resolve. When she wasn't consumed by contractions, she directed him calmly, her voice never betraying the terror he knew she must feel. And then, as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, a new sound filled the small cabin, the powerful, angry cry of a newborn. "A girl," Dustin said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't name as he held the tiny, squalling infant. Following Bethany's instructions, he cleaned the baby, wrapped her in a soft blanket, and placed her in her mother's trembling arms. "Hello, little one," Bethany whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Hello, my Emma." Dustin stood awkwardly, feeling like an intruder on this sacred moment between mother and child. He should leave, give them privacy, go back to his cabin and his solitude. But his feet wouldn't move. "Dustin," Bethany said softly. "Thank you." He nodded, not trusting his voice. Would you like to hold her?" The question froze him. He hadn't held a baby since his sister's child, before the war, before everything changed. His hands had done terrible things since then. "I shouldn't," he said hoarsely. "Please," she insisted. "I need to rest for just a moment." Reluctantly, he held out his arms, and Bethany carefully transferred the tiny bundle. Emma's eyes were squeezed shut, her face red and wrinkled, a shock of dark hair plastered to her head. She weighed almost nothing, yet Dustin felt the weight of her acutely, not as a burden, but as a profound responsibility. "Support her head," Bethany murmured, her eyes already drifting closed with exhaustion. Dustin adjusted his hold, cradling the infant against his chest. Emma fussed briefly, then settled, her tiny hand somehow finding its way out of the blanket to wrap around his finger. Something broke open inside him, something he'd thought long dead. For hours, he sat in the rocking chair he'd repaired days earlier, holding Emma while Bethany slept. When the baby grew restless, he found himself humming an old tune his mother had sung to him, rocking gently back and forth until she drifted off again. The town doctor arrived mid-morning, shocked to find Dustin Drake cradling a newborn. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek. Not only had the bitter cowboy helped deliver Bethany Reed's baby, but he was now playing nursemaid. In the days that followed, Dustin found reasons to stay. Bethany needed help, he told himself. She couldn't manage alone with a newborn. He slept on a bedroll by the hearth, chopped wood, brought water, cooked simple meals, and took his turn walking Emma when she refused to sleep. "You're good with her?" Bethany observed one night, watching as Dustin paced the small cabin. Emma snuggled against his shoulder. "Had a niece once," he admitted. "Long time ago." "What happened?" "War happened. Influenza happened." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. As weeks passed, Dustin's visits to his own cabin became briefer, just long enough to check that everything was secure before returning to Bethany and Emma. The townsfolk's whispers evolved from scandal to speculation about the nature of their arrangement. Some of the kinder souls brought food or offered assistance, which Bethany graciously accepted. One evening in late July, as Dustin rocked Emma to sleep, Bethany sat at her small table writing a letter. "It's to Thomas's parents," she explained. "They should know about Emma." Dustin nodded, continuing the slow, steady rocking that always soothed the baby. "They've asked me to come live with them in Denver," she continued, her eyes on the letter rather than him. Something cold and heavy settled in Dustin's chest. "When?" "I haven't decided if I'm going." She set down her pen. "What do you think I should do?" He looked down at Emma, now sleeping peacefully in his arms. The thought of not seeing her every day, of not watching her grow, created a hollow ache he couldn't bear. "Denver's a good city," he said, the words like ashes in his mouth. "Good schools, better opportunities than Willow Creek." "That's not what I asked," Bethany said gently. Dustin carefully placed Emma in her crib, the crib he had finished with his own hands before turning to face Bethany. "What do you want me to say?" he asked, his voice low and rough. The truth, she replied simply. The truth is I'm not good enough for either of you, he said. I've done things, Bethany. Bad things. So have most men out here, she countered. We all have pasts, Dustin. Mine's worse than most. She stood and approached him, fearless as always. I don't believe that. I've seen how you are with Emma. How you are with me. That doesn't erase what I've done. No, she agreed. But it shows who you really are, underneath all that bitterness you wear like armor. He turned away, unable to bear the hope in her eyes. You deserve better than a broken-down cowboy with blood on his hands. What I deserve, she said firmly, is to make my own choice about what and who I want in my life. She placed her hand on his arm, and he flinched, not from her touch, but from the surge of longing it provoked. Dustin, look at me. Reluctantly, he met her gaze. I'm not asking for promises. I'm not asking you to be something you're not. I'm just asking if you want us to stay. The question hung in the air between them, filled with possibility and terror in equal measure. Dustin had spent years avoiding attachments, avoiding the pain that inevitably followed caring about someone. But standing here, with Bethany looking at him like he was worth something, with Emma sleeping peacefully in the crib he'd built, he realized he'd already failed at keeping his distance. He already cared. He already had everything to lose. Yes, he finally whispered. I want you to stay. The smile that bloomed on her face made his heart stutter. Then I'll stay. Before he could respond, Emma began to fuss. Bethany moved to go to her, but Dustin gently caught her arm. Let me, he said. He lifted Emma from the crib, cradling her against his chest and resuming his pacing, his deep voice humming the familiar lullaby. Over the baby's head, his eyes met Bethany's, and for the first time in years, Dustin Drake felt something dangerously close to hope. August turned to September, and as summer's heat gave way to autumn's crisp mornings, their arrangement evolved. Dustin brought his few possessions from his cabin, including a trunk he'd kept locked for years. One evening, after Emma was asleep, he opened it for Bethany. Inside lay the remnants of his former life military discharge papers, a few photographs, a Bible, and a small velvet pouch. I was married once, he told her, his voice barely audible. Her name was Eliza. We had a son, William. Bethany listened silently as he revealed the story he'd never told anyone in Willow Creek. How he'd returned from the war changed, haunted by what he'd seen and done. How he'd tried to be the husband and father they deserved. How influenza had taken them both in the winter of '68, while he was away hunting. I couldn't save them, he said, his voice breaking. Came home to find them both gone. It wasn't your fault, Bethany said softly, her hand covering his. Felt like it was. After that, I drifted. Did jobs for people who didn't ask questions. Became someone I didn't recognize. He took a deep breath. Then I came here, thinking I'd just stay long enough to earn money for supplies before heading deeper into the mountains. That was 3 years ago. And now? She asked. Now I'm wondering if maybe I've been punishing myself long enough. He looked at her directly. If maybe I could try to be a good man again. You already are, she said firmly. The weeks that followed brought subtle changes. Dustin began accompanying Bethany to church on Sundays, enduring the curious stares of the congregation. He accepted occasional carpentry jobs in town, his skilled hands creating furniture that quickly gained a reputation for quality. And each night, he rocked Emma to sleep, his bitter past receding a little more with each lullaby. In October, Sheriff Wilson approached Dustin after church. Drake, he said with a nod. Got a proposition for you. Dustin tensed, old instincts flaring. What kind of proposition? Deputy position. Town's growing. Need someone who knows how to handle trouble before it starts. Dustin stared at him. You know who I was. The sheriff shrugged. Know who you are now. Family man. Skilled carpenter. Someone people are starting to respect. Family man. The words echoed in Dustin's head as he glanced at Bethany, who was chatting with the preacher's wife, Emma bundled in her arms. I'll think on it, he promised. That evening, he discussed the offer with Bethany as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains. You'd make a good deputy, she said thoughtfully. You're fair. You understand people. You think I should take it? I think, she said carefully, that it might help you forgive yourself to protect people instead of hurting them, he finished. She nodded. The next day, Dustin accepted the position. The town's reaction was mixed. Some welcomed the additional protection, while others muttered about putting a fox in charge of the henhouse. But as weeks passed and Dustin proved himself both fair and effective, the muttering subsided. By Christmas, something remarkable had happened. Dustin Drake had become a respected member of the community. The bitter recluse was now Deputy Drake, who nodded greetings to townsfolk and occasionally even smiled. He, Bethany, and Emma were invited to holiday gatherings, where people watched in amazement as the once fearsome cowboy gently rocked an infant to sleep amidst the festivities. On Christmas Eve, after returning from the town celebration, Dustin built a fire in the hearth while Bethany put Emma to bed. When she returned to the main room, he was standing nervously by the mantel. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box he'd carved himself, inlaid with a delicate pattern of leaves. Inside lay a ring not fancy or new, but well-crafted and clearly meaningful. It was my mother's, he explained. I've been carrying it since. Well, for a long time. Bethany's eyes widened as she realized what this meant. I know it's not much, he continued, his voice rough with emotion. And I know I'm not what you probably dreamed of. But I love you, Bethany. I love Emma. And if you'll have me, I'd like to be a family properly. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. Is that a yes? He asked, a smile breaking across his weathered face. Yes, she managed. Yes, Dustin Drake. They were married on New Year's Day, 1879, in the small church in Willow Creek. Emma, now 7 months old, was passed among adoring townsfolk during the celebration afterward. No one who witnessed Dustin's face as he watched his new wife and daughter could have called him bitter anymore. Spring arrived, bringing new life to the mountains and new possibilities to the Drake family. Dustin's reputation as both deputy and craftsman brought steady work and respect. Bethany began teaching again, holding classes for the town's children in their home during the afternoons. One evening in April, as Dustin rocked Emma to sleep, he caught Bethany watching him with a particular expression he'd come to recognize. What is it? He asked softly, continuing the gentle motion that was lulling the baby to sleep. I was just thinking, she replied, about how far we've come. A year ago I was alone and afraid. You were bitter, he supplied with a small smile. Yes, she agreed. And now look at us. He looked down at Emma, her eyes fluttering closed as she surrendered to sleep. Then at Bethany, her face glowing in the lamplight. His family, his redemption. I have something to tell you, Bethany said, her voice trembling slightly with excitement. Dustin raised an eyebrow, waiting. It seems Emma will be a big sister by winter. Joy, pure and powerful, surged through him. You're sure? She nodded, her smile radiant. Dr. Miller confirmed it today. Carefully, so as not to wake Emma, Dustin rose and placed her in her crib. Then he crossed to Bethany, taking her hands in his. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. For what? For giving me a second chance at life. At family. Thank you, she countered, for showing me that sometimes the most unexpected path leads exactly where you need to go. As they stood together in the warmth of their home, with their daughter sleeping peacefully and the promise of new life on the horizon, Dustin Drake marveled at how completely his life had transformed. The bitterness that had defined him for so long had been replaced by something he'd never thought to feel again: happiness. The townsfolk of Willow Creek still told stories about Dustin Drake, but now they spoke of the transformation they'd witnessed. How the bitterest man in the territory had been changed by the love of a brave woman and the simple act of rocking her baby to sleep. It became something of a legend in those parts, a reminder that redemption could find even the most hardened hearts, and that family could be found in the most unexpected places. In the years that followed, as their family grew and their roots in Willow Creek deepened, Dustin would sometimes think back to that fateful day when he'd offered his place in line to a pregnant stranger. One small act of kindness that had saved him from a lifetime of solitude. Each night, no matter how tired he was from his duties as deputy or his work as a carpenter, Dustin Drake would rock whichever child needed soothing, humming the same lullaby his mother had sung to him, that he had sung to his first son, and now shared with his new family. In those quiet moments, with the child's trust heavy in his arms, he found a peace he'd never thought possible. They said the cowboy was bitter, until the pregnant woman made him rock her baby to sleep. And in that rocking he had found his way home.